Welcome, everybody. Welcome to those in the meeting. Welcome to those watching the video afterwards to the first social contract research seminar of the new academic year here in Australia. This semester, we're focusing on questions around artificial intelligence and how those relate to the social contract and to the common good. Can artificial intelligence contribute to the common good? And indeed, is there a moment at which we would have to consider some form of AI as a subject of the common good alongside human beings? Those are the sort of questions we're going to be thinking about. And I can think of no one better to begin our discussion of these topics than our speaker for this session. Dr Geoff Keeling is a fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London. He's an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, and he's also a staff research scientist at Google. He works on the ethical and societal impacts of AI, with interests including alignment and manipulation, trust, digital minds, and human AI relationships. Prior to his time at Google, he held a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University and completed a PhD in philosophy at the University of Bristol. Geoff and his co-author Winnie Street have a book coming out with Cambridge University Press in May entitled Emerging Questions in AI Welfare. And that is also the title of Geoff's paper for this session. So would you please join me in welcoming our speaker for this seminar, Dr. Geoff Keeling.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Can you see that okay?
Wonderful.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, as Chris said, Winnie Street and I have recently finished this book called Emerging Questions in AI Welfare. And what I want to do is present some of the main ideas from that book today. Before we get started, the powers that be at Google have asked me to make explicitly clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of Google. So anything I say, any views I express may not be representative of Google's views. This is not a Google talk. I'm doing this with my Institute of Philosophy hat on, and it's an Institute of Philosophy book, just in case there was any ambiguity about that. Okay, so to get started, the public conversation on AI consciousness and moral patienthood is snowballing. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a flurry of news articles discussing whether AI systems might be conscious or capable of suffering or capable of having some kind of moral standing, counting in their own right. Often these topics are discussed in conjunction with other topics, such as AI-induced psychosis or delusional belief reinforcement. But in a significant minority of cases, journalists are lending credence to expert opinions which acknowledge the possibility of AI consciousness or welfare, and often assign significant probability to that outcome. Some people from Anthropic have been floating figures in the ballpark of 20% that Claude is conscious, which is a startling view to hold, in my opinion at least. In addition to this sort of attention in the news media, we've also seen CEOs from major AI labs wading in on the issue. This includes Dario Amodei, who just last month said that we're deeply uncertain about whether Claude is conscious. And on the other side of things, Mustafa Suleyman, who is the CEO of Microsoft AI and formerly co-founded DeepMind, suggesting that the issue of AI consciousness as a research topic is currently kind of premature and dangerous to work on. Meanwhile, Anthropic has also dedicated significant resources to tackling the problem of AI welfare. So in 2024, they hired Kyle Fish as their AI welfare officer, and Kyle is now building out a team conducting fundamental research on AI welfare, building evaluations for AI welfare. And since at least the Claude 3.7 model release, they've also been including AI welfare evaluations as part of their model release cards, which is a really interesting development. Alongside that, there's also nonprofits such as Elios AI Research, which are pursuing fundamental research in AI welfare and contributing to the policy agenda on that same topic. And alongside these nonprofits, there's also centers at universities such as the NYU Center for Mind Ethics and Policy and the recently founded Cambridge Center for Digital Minds that are pursuing similar agendas. So the salient point here is that the topics of AI consciousness and welfare have quite rapidly moved from what many people would take to be a fringe concern, right on the edges of acceptable discourse in AI, right the way through to an increasingly central aspect of that public discourse. And this represents a profound change from where we were just a few years ago when, for instance, Blake Lemoine was fired from Google after he believed that Lambda had become sentient. I remember where I was when that incident happened, and it seems so far out as a possibility that somebody would be treating LLMs as sentient entities. And now this is strikingly such a central aspect of the attention that AI is getting in the popular discourse. So mine and Winnie's view is that AI consciousness and welfare or moral patienthood more generally will plausibly be among the defining societal issues of our time. I think it's entirely possible that current interest in this topic is a symptom of current hype around AI and may just be a sort of knee-jerk and under-theorized reaction to a novel class of technologies. But it's equally possible that as AI systems become increasingly embedded into every aspect of our lives, maintaining coherent identities over time with distinctive profiles of behavioral and possibly psychological dispositions, that a substantive kind of subset of the population will either come to believe or at least be open-minded to the possibility that AI systems are conscious or have other properties capable of grounding welfare-based interests. It's also similarly possible that as AI capabilities increase, that AI labs themselves become deeply uncertain or start to form positive commitments about the moral and metaphysical status of the systems that they're creating. Indeed, this may already be apparent if people have read the recent draft of the Claude Constitution by Amanda Askell and Joe Carlsmith, where they express deep uncertainty about what kind of entity Claude is and whether Claude has moral standing. And Claude is fine-tuned on that document, so there may be sort of interesting feedback loops here where the models themselves begin to acquire beliefs in line with how they're being trained. So overall, whatever our priors on AI consciousness and welfare, I think it's at least plausible that this will become increasingly central as a kind of topic in the policy and public discourse on AI, with potentially major legal, social, and political ramifications. So with that in mind, we decided to write this book. We don't have a cover yet, so I asked you to imagine a nice cover for it. And what our book does is give an exploration of several of the key questions in AI welfare. I would say from a systematic and somewhat skeptical perspective. I think both Winnie and I assign a very low probability to current frontier models being conscious or having any other such properties. And yeah, my aim in this talk is just to say a little bit about the kinds of questions that our book addresses. So we can start with a definition. Call something a welfare subject, just in case it's the kind of thing for which things can go better or worse. So what does this mean? Well, a welfare subject is an entity which has morally significant interests, which can be advanced or frustrated. So being a welfare subject implies being a moral patient. That's something that counts morally in its own right and for its own sake. It may be the case that there are certain moral patients that aren't welfare subjects, but for all intents and purposes, I'm going to treat these two things as coextensive. The set of welfare subjects standardly is taken to include, at least humans and some non-human animals. I would say that, roughly speaking, our confidence in whether some particular animal is a welfare subject roughly tracks their phylogenetic proximity to humans. So for species that are phylogenetically very close to us, like mammals, which have a similar neuroanatomy to us, they have a midbrain and a cortex, we can be reasonably confident that they experience the world in roughly the same way to us. They experience pleasure and pain like we do, and thus have welfare-based interests. For phylogenetically distant species, like, say, insects or cephalopod mollusks, the picture is much less clear. We really don't know if they're welfare subjects, but we can do certain kinds of science which might shed light on that possibility. For example, in the case of cephalopod mollusks, there are certain experiments where you can, say, administer a toxin to the skin of an octopus, and then you will observe that it does certain behaviors which are at least consistent with experiencing pain, such as tending to the wound. And then if you administer an analgesic, that sort of wound tending behavior tends to stop, which is at least a prima facie reason to think that an octopus can feel pain. But obviously those experiments are highly unclear. It's not obvious exactly how to interpret them. So the question our book is concerned with is, could an AI system be a welfare subject, either now or in the near future? This question is much harder than the case of phylogenetically distant animals because we have basically no common ground with AI systems whatsoever. They're not like a very distant species where we can sort of point to at least some phylogenetic similarities. They really are almost totally different. Maybe sort of neural networks at a very abstract level are loosely inspired by neurobiology, but that analogy is so loose as to leave very little in place for kind of analogical reasoning. When I talk about AI systems today, I'm going to be talking about large language models and related systems like reasoning models or LLM-based agents. I'm not going to talk about things like neuromorphic systems, which are quite interesting from a welfare point of view and may actually be far more plausible as candidates for welfare than LLMs. But given the attention that LLMs presently have and the amount of investment that's been thrown at them, I think LLMs are a sort of more important topic to focus on. So why would we think that an AI system could be a welfare subject, or at least a plausible candidate for welfare? Our book centers around what we call the schematic plausibility case for AI welfare. This is not one argument, but rather a family of arguments that share a common structure. And these arguments begin with what we call welfare-relevant features. So a welfare-relevant feature is a property that could, in principle, ground welfare. This includes stuff like phenomenal consciousness, which is the sort of capacity for subjective experience. It also includes sentience, the capacity for valence, subjective experience, like pleasure and pain states, states which feel good and bad. It also includes agency, which is a complicated concept, but minimally includes having belief-like and desire-like states that kind of conspire to explain action in the standard way. Also possibly things like having a soul, being a person, being self-aware, and so on and so forth. We don't have an exhaustive list of welfare-relevant features because there could be reasonable disagreement about what kinds of properties could in principle ground welfare, but we take these paradigmatic examples to be sufficient for the purposes of the discussion. So then the argument for sort of taking AI welfare seriously typically runs something like this. The first premise is, well, plausibly, AI systems have or will soon have some welfare-relevant feature F, be it consciousness, sentience, or whatever. And then things with F are plausible candidate welfare subjects, and therefore AIs are or will soon be plausible candidate welfare subjects. This argument on its own doesn't get you to any kind of practical conclusion. So typically people add, if this conclusion is true, then we ought to be taking precautionary welfare interventions now, where a precautionary welfare intervention is an intervention that, conditional on AIs being welfare subjects, is at least presumptively beneficial for AIs. Arguments of this kind have been advanced by a bunch of different people, including Rob Long and Jeff Sebo, who focus specifically on the sentience and agency versions of the argument. But also Brian Cutter, for instance, has advanced an argument of this kind, sort of which uses soul as the relevant welfare-relevant feature. I think what's interesting about this argument is, firstly, how profound and striking the conclusion is. If this argument is sound, this is an enormous, enormous conclusion, which says something about a very strange class of entities and how it relates to us. It's really kind of admitting, a very strange kind of alien intelligence type thing into our moral circle, which is a huge bar to clear, in my view. The argument's also interesting because it gives rise to a number of extremely difficult philosophical and scientific questions on which we can expect people to disagree profoundly. And what I'll do for the remainder of the talk is articulate some of those questions and walk through some of the central considerations. So the first question we can ask is, what exactly does AI refer to here? When we talk about an AI being a candidate welfare subject, it's far from obvious what we actually mean when we say AI. Just to sketch some of the complexity around this question, there's at least three categories of things that we could be talking about when we talk about AI. So one of these things is models, another is characters, which are simulated by models, and a third thing is agents, which exist in virtue of sampling from models and then take actions in the world, say on behalf of a user. None of these categories is in themselves straightforward. For example, Anthropic has a model welfare program, but it's not at all obvious, what the model that they're talking about actually is, right? If you try to think about the sort of identity and individuation conditions for models, it very, very quickly becomes quite metaphysically complicated. I think at least one way into that question is to take a sort of Aristotelian four causes approach, where you might, for example, ask about the formal cause of a model. What's the formal cause of a model? Well, again, that's not obvious. It could be that the sort of inputs and outputs of the model, taking the model just to be a function, which takes as inputs sequences of tokens and outputs probability distributions over a vocabulary. It could just be that the set of pairs of inputs and outputs is what characterizes the formal cause of the model. It could also be that the actual algorithmic steps that take you from the inputs to the outputs, like the actual structure of the transformer, is what constitutes the model. And it could also be the geometry of the embeddings that the model realizes either in its kind of final layer before I'm sort of decoding, or the entire sequence of embeddings as you go through the transformer. All of those things are plausible interpretations of what the formal cause of a model might be. But then you can also ask, for instance, about the material cause of the model. What is the material basis for the model? This is a really messy picture, given that models are typically far too large to be situated on a single GPU, so they're often sharded across multiple GPUs. And it's also the case that the model, as it's instantiated across GPUs, has little relation to the chat you have, because often queries are batched across different chats at inference time, so that one particular GPU may be processing many different conversations from many different users. So it's a really messy picture once you get into the metaphysics of what a model is. You can get sort of similar questions about characters. Character is the sort of person-like thing that you interact with when you talk to a model. Obviously, the character stands in some relation to the model, which might be simulation or role play, depending on your preferred account. And we can ask various questions about characters, like, do characters exist? Do they have mental states? Are those mental states which can actually realize welfare, and so on? And similar questions too can be asked about agents. I want to flag that these three categories are not intended as mutually exclusive or exhaustive. It's entirely possible that all three are welfare subjects, or that none of them are. It's also possible that certain combinations, could be like, it could be the case that a model is a welfare subject and an agent. All of those things are at least possible, and that's worth bearing in mind as we consider the argument. Okay, so let's now turn to a second question that this argument for AI welfare presents us with. How exactly are we supposed to assess the plausibility of claims to the effect that an AI system has a given welfare-relevant feature F? I think an interesting starting observation here is that different welfare-relevant features require us to engage with different ways of knowing about the world. So if I were to claim that Claude is a person, this is the kind of claim that, to assess whether it's true or false, we need to engage in some kind of a priori metaphysical theorizing. If I were to claim that Claude is conscious, you can imagine some amount of metaphysical theorizing being involved there, but it's also the case that there's some science that we could do to try to shed light on that claim. There's an emerging science of consciousness that looks at the neural correlates of consciousness, and we could, in principle, kind of look to that science to inform our views on that claim. For other properties like having a soul, we may need to engage with ways of knowing, such as knowledge through revelation or scripture. So the salient point here is that depending on which version of the argument you run, you may end up with a very different epistemic standard applying. But for the purposes of today's talk, what I want to do is just talk about one of the central disputes that's currently being discussed in relation to evidence for AIs having welfare-relevant features. So the basic problem of this dispute is, we have kind of prima facie evidence of welfare-relevant features in LLMs. At the very least, LLMs certainly look like they have welfare-relevant features from time to time. They might talk about having emotions or conscious states and so on. And there's a question about, well, what exactly do we do with that prima facie evidence? How do we respond to it? And there's kind of two views that have got quite a lot of attention. So on the one hand, we have what we call the face value view, which just says, well, you can take that prima facie evidence at face value. This is the kind of view that is in the background with someone like Blake Lemoine when he says, I know a person when I talk to it. The thought is, through having a conversation with Lambda, Lambda made all kinds of claims about its properties, and Lemoine took that at face value and used that as a basis for thinking that Lambda was a welfare subject. And then on the flip side, you have what we call the no evidential weight view. I'd say this is probably the most common view in the current academic discussion. So people like Susan Schneider, for instance, and Neil Seth seem to defend versions of this view, or at least be very sympathetic to it. And what this view says is that the prima facie evidence of welfare-relevant features in LLMs has no evidential weight. There's some kind of story we can tell about LLMs, which makes it the case that the apparent evidence just isn't really evidence, and so all of that can be dismissed out of hand. There's at least 3 arguments that are given for the no evidential weight view that merit discussion. So the first argument is it kind of orbits the topic of anthropomorphism. The idea is something like, to the extent that welfare-relevant features are perceived in LLMs, this is really something that's happening on the user side rather than the LLM side. The user is projecting these properties onto the LLM, given the human tendency for anthropomorphism. This is not something that originated in the welfare literature. If you look back a few years to the early disputes about LLMs and semantic understanding, people like Emily Bender and Timnit Gebru argued that the appearance of semantic understanding in LLMs is something that users project onto them, but they actually lack semantic understanding internally. Whether or not that argument is sound is another question, but I think that's the kind of ancestral origin of these arguments in the welfare space. And I think to kind of precify the argument a bit more, you can think of it in terms of an appeal to second-order evidence. So you might think, look, if you learn that your belief that P is the result of a defective cognitive process, that gives you either some reason to doubt your belief that P, or maybe totally undermines it. So like if you think that, the curtains are talking to you and then you learn that your drink has been spiked with MDMA, then it's, that presumably gives you at least some reason to lower your credence in the belief that the curtains are talking to you. Our view is that anthropomorphism is a serious consideration, which at the very least suggests not to take apparent evidence of welfare-relevant features at face value. That seems to be inappropriate, given the clear risks that we might be anthropomorphizing. But it also doesn't obviously give, a huge amount of weight to the no evidential weight view. It's entirely possible that you could have some reason to think that your cognitive process is defective, but not have reason to kind of throw out all the relevant beliefs wholesale. And I think a good example of that is if you look back at sort of the history of primatology to, say, Jane Goodall's work on chimps. Goodall was systematically accused by the scientific community of engaging in inappropriate forms of anthropomorphism to understand chimp behavior. But it turned out she was actually totally right. Like, chimps do have interesting social structures. They do have interesting mentality. So there's clearly a bit of give and take here with the role that anthropomorphism can play in science. And some theorists have worked quite hard to make precise exactly what that might look like. So Frans de Waal, for example, has argued that there's a distinction between human-centric anthropomorphism, which is kind of the naive application of human-like properties to non-human entities, and what he calls animal-centric anthropomorphism, which is a kind of empathetic way to doing primatology, where you really take the chimp's worldview as your center point, and then you can engage in kind of limited anthropomorphism, taking, for example, concepts like play, trying to use that to understand the chimp behavior, and to the extent that that, is kind of consistent with the evidence over time, that is at least a plausible way to go about investigating what chimps are up to. And we might think that a similar thing applies in the case of LLMs. Then we have a second class of arguments that we call reductive arguments. You've probably heard various versions of this argument, like, LLMs are just next token predictors, or LLMs are just matrix multipliers. And that kind of reductive picture is taken to be inconsistent with having welfare-relevant features like a soul or consciousness or whatever. At first blush, I don't think these arguments are very convincing. Like, if you make similar arguments about people, you might say, look, I don't have a soul because I'm just chemicals. And it's just like, well, that's just a bad argument. Things can be explained at different levels of abstraction and in different ways. And it's, very difficult to show that some reductive material picture of something is inconsistent with, some other level of analysis. Even so, I don't think the reductive people are totally crazy. So I think there are plausible features like embodiment, which are inconsistent with, say, being a matrix multiplier, which you might think are necessary conditions on properties like consciousness. Like, it's by no means a ridiculous view to think that something is conscious only if it's an embodied system. And that is a very serious concern. But I think that the key lesson here is that, we can't be hugely confident about what's necessary for what in such an uncertain space. The scientific sort of status of theories of consciousness is quite dubious, and it's not obvious we can just sort of say, look, embodiment is necessary for consciousness. We can at best say that's kind of like a plausible view. So I think the reductive arguments give us, again, reason for caution and, again, reason not to take the face value view, but I don't think it goes as far as to establish the no evidential weight view. And then finally, we have these interesting arguments, which we call causal debunking arguments. They're kind of reminiscent of causal debunking arguments in metaethics, where people basically tell a story about how our moral intuitions are evolved and use that to try to undermine moral realism. The thought here is something like, well, look, LLMs are trained on lots of internet text data, and that includes discussions of internal states, among other things. And so it's totally unsurprising that LLMs would be able to generate behavioral evidence, which at least looks like discussions of internal states. And that then is supposed to kind of undermine the idea that when we see that kind of evidence, that it points to the relevant internal states. It's unclear to what extent this argument works. Firstly, you can imagine LLMs having the relevant causal history and nevertheless developing the relevant mental states. If you take like a relatively uncontroversial feature like agency, just having beliefs and desire-like states, it's plausible that an LLM could acquire belief-like and desire-like states in the process of being trained. Perhaps that is the best way to model internet text data. We can also imagine LLMs being produced via totally different causal stories. So you might, for example, just sample GPT-3 out of the set of all possible LLMs with that kind of parameterization. And it still seems then like there's a substantive question to ask about, whether the thing has agency, whether it's conscious, and so on and so forth. So I don't really assign a huge amount of weight to causal debunking arguments, as at the very least establishing that we should give no evidential weight to these features. Okay, so what exactly should we do then? Well, I think probably the best middle ground view is to adopt a scientific view in thinking about AI consciousness. So what does this mean? We should systematically interrogate the relevant prima facie evidence, try to triangulate it with different kinds of evidence, whether that's from the empirical sciences or metaphysics, whatever, and use that to build a plausibility case in favor of or against AI welfare. I don't think it's that helpful to keep the dispute at the kind of high level ideological, either, let's just take this at face value or let's, dismiss it out of hand. I think this is at least somewhat tractable as a scientific and a metaphysical problem. And to the extent that we can, we should investigate it. Okay, so I now want to turn to another question presented by this class of arguments. So why should we think that different welfare relevant features render something a plausible candidate welfare subject? I think, like, to give a very sort of broad brush, sort of almost Nietzschean picture of this, I think like we used to have this idea of a soul being very central to philosophy, and then analytic philosophy kind of booted that out. And now we have like a bunch of things in the neighborhood of soul, like consciousness, sentience, self-awareness, personhood, and so on, that are kind of trying to do that moral work, but where the conceptual connections between the relevant properties are not that clear. So if we look at some examples, so like here I'm using the term consciousness to mean just phenomenal consciousness. So like in Nagel's terms, something is conscious just in case there's something is like to be that thing. And then sentience is like valenced mental states, so pleasure and pain. You can ask, like, what exactly is the conceptual connection between being phenomenally conscious and being a welfare subject? That is the kind of entity for which things can go better or worse. Shelley Kagan asks us to imagine this really boring entity which can just see the color blue. And he's like, well, this is actually not like a particularly obvious candidate. For welfare, it's not clear how things could go better and worse for an entity that simply perceives the color blue. And I think I agree with him on that. It's not obvious that mere phenomenal consciousness is sort of straightforwardly connected to welfare. Sentience, on the other hand, I think there's a much more plausible case for. It does seem to be the case that the valence of mental states like pleasure and pain connects to the idea of things going better or worse really well. So sentience, I think, is at least plausible as a sufficient condition on welfare, and much more so than mere consciousness. And then sort of independently of the question of like how plausible are these properties as grounds for welfare, there's also this separate question of empirical tractability. So like, how on earth would we know if an AI system was conscious or sentient. There's sort of various approaches that people have proposed. I think the strongest approach is what some people call the architectural approach, where the idea is to take particular sort of neural structures in humans that we think to be responsible for consciousness, and then sort of look in the transformer and ask, can we see anything remotely analogous to that? So, for instance, one theory of consciousness in the human case is the global workspace theory. And the thought is, can we see anything resembling a global workspace in the transformer? If yes, that's at least a prima facie case for the transformer being conscious. In practice, this is incredibly difficult to pull off. The global workspace theory, for instance, can be formulated at various levels of abstraction, from like an extremely schematic theory all the way through to a detailed, what's called the global neuronal workspace theory. And depending on what level of detail you want to go, it's going to be much less or much more plausible that the transformer has the relevant kind of thing. It's also not clear, sort of, inferentially, whether you can kind of get to a negative case for consciousness from the absence of, say, a global workspace. So like, if a transformer had an obvious global workspace, that would be a good reason to think it's conscious. But lacking that is not obviously a reason to think it's not conscious, because we only know that a global workspace is sufficient, for example, assuming the global workspace theory is actually true. In addition, we have behavioral approaches. So these approaches try to elicit behaviors from models that are plausibly indicative of models being conscious. So you might think, for example, that models having stable preferences is potentially indicative of them being conscious if those preferences track interesting, like phenomenal things, like, say, preferences for, or preferences against what seem like distressing things and preferences in favor of what seem like pleasurable things. You may think that's sort of evidence of consciousness, but again, the evidential connection is very dubious, especially because of the potential for mimicry, going back to the causal debunking arguments. And then finally, there's this sort of class of approaches called introspective approaches, where the idea is to try to fine-tune the model to have introspective access into its internal states. Some versions of this are much more plausible than others. So, for instance, you can fine-tune a model to have calibrated confidence estimates, where its self-reported levels of confidence track its general disposition to, say, like, answer the question positively some fraction of the time if you ask the model the question lots of times. But doing this about phenomenal states is highly unclear, whether that actually tracks anything meaningful. There's no obvious mechanism by which a model would have access to such internal states. So again, that's kind of a work in progress. So yeah, the overall empirical picture is a bit sketchy at the moment, and I don't think we have any positive reason at present to believe that models are conscious or sentient. And then to look at another property, we have kind of agency. There's obviously many, many different kinds of agency, ranging from the sort of minimal agency that a Roomba might have with sort of belief-like and desire-like states, all the way through to kind of various forms of reflective agency where, the thing might have like second-order desires, all the way through to what you might think of as a kind of like autopoietic agency, where the thing has the ability to kind of self-sustain and self-manufacture over time in the way that a non-human animal might. And you might think that, that process in itself is sufficient for the thing to have kind of ultimate goals in its own right, as opposed to goals that are simply conferred on it by another agent. And depending on your views, you may think any or none of these is sufficient for being a welfare subject. There's a couple of different ways to kind of motivate the idea of agency as a ground for welfare. I don't think any of them are hugely convincing. So one is simply to appeal to thought experiments. So, for instance, you can imagine like a highly complex civilization of entities that seem very agentic, which we know to be non-conscious, and you might think that there's a kind of, you might have the moral intuition that it's wrong to interfere with that civilization in some way. It would be bad just to, kill them all, for instance. I think, once you start throwing in other cases into the mix, these intuitions start to break down a bit. It's like, okay, if you had to compare a number of the known to be non-conscious agentic things with like a human baby, like how are you going to draw those trade-offs? And most people would probably say that the human baby takes sort of lexical priority over the non-conscious agentic things. So like, yeah, people have case intuitions. I don't know how exactly to square that picture, but I would be hesitant to accept an agency view on the basis of a few case intuitions alone. I think a slightly more plausible case is kind of trying to deconstruct the case for sentience. So if you recall Kagan's example of the entity that just sees the color blue, if you imagine it can say see a few more colors and then you add a preference ordering over those colors, it seems like the ability to perceive colors plus the preference ordering may be sufficient for something like welfare. But again, I think the kind of intuitions involved in this sort of argument are a little unclear. It's hard to sort of know exactly what the preference ordering consists in here, because the preference ordering is just a kind of formal representation of presumably like behavioral dispositions or something like that. And I think we'd need more information on like what those behavioral dispositions amounted to, because it could just be that the color perception is in itself valenced and then the entity would be sentient. So like, who knows? But yeah, the agency picture overall doesn't seem to me that plausible. And then finally, I just want to flag like a class of views which are getting quite a lot of traction at the moment, which basically deny that there is a fact of the matter about moral status. So these views kind of follow what sort of David Gunkel and Mark Hockelberg think of as a sort of relational turn in ethics. To the extent that I understand this view, I think it begins with the kind of denial of moral realism. So they want to say that there is no fact of the matter about whether or not something is a welfare subject, and also that welfare is just not the kind of thing where there's some property of the entity, like say consciousness, which gives rise to welfare. But they then kind of present this alternative positive picture alongside that negative view, where they think that welfare is basically something that is conferred on an entity, basically like to bring it into our particular moral community. When I talked to David Gunkel about this, it seemed to me that he actually just takes this to be a descriptive picture of the kind of human practice of morality, as opposed to a kind of normative picture of what we ought to do. And thus it's pretty unclear to me like how this kind of relational picture can firstly like account for obvious instances of wrongdoing, like factory farming is bad. The fact that we don't relate to the animals who are factory farmed in the right way just seems irrelevant to whether or not their suffering grounds reasons for action. So it's just not obvious to me how this can kind of account for current plausible moral intuitions, let alone kind of provide a plausible story about how we should navigate the AI case. But needless to say, this is getting quite a lot of traction, I think, because of its kind of anti-metaphysical flavor. So there's sort of Joel Lebo and co at DeepMind have recently defended this pragmatic view of AI personhood, and Murray Shanahan, and he has kind of Wittgensteinian commitments that at the very least vibe with the relational views, is also kind of defending similar views. My own take here is that the bar for welfare should be quite high. There are significant distinctions between entities that can feel pain and entities which can't, and we should avoid kind of running to these views which are fairly easy to put together, but kind of allow us to sort of bury all the metaphysics under the carpet. I think it's actually much better to articulate all the metaphysics, put it on the table, and acknowledge the complexity of the dispute. I don't want to kind of commit some like catastrophic moral error because we didn't want to kind of face up to the difficulty of the metaphysics. Okay, so I'll now turn to a final question, which concerns whether precautionary reasoning applies to AI systems given our current uncertainty. So basically, what we can do here is kind of appeal to some version of the precautionary principle, which roughly says, we ought to play it safe when uncertain about whether AI systems are welfare subjects, where playing it safe amounts to taking reasonable steps to protecting the potential welfare-based interests of AIs. So Anthropic's recent sort of welfare interventions, like giving AI systems the ability to exit conversations, or giving AI systems free time to play in virtual environments, or saving model weights in case AI systems need to be compensated later down the line for harms done at present. All of these things are motivated by some version of the precautionary principle. This principle obviously invites some really difficult questions. There's this kind of like epistemic question of like, well, how certain do we need to be before the precautionary principle kicks in? What exactly is the evidential standard where, after we've reached that standard, it would be reckless to dismiss the possibility of AIs being welfare subjects? And also, like, how does that cohere with other kinds of entities in the world and our intuitions about the proper treatment for them? For example, like I don't know, mycorrhizal fungal networks demonstrate all kinds of sophisticated agentic behavior, like really sophisticated economic behavior in their sort of resource exchange with plant root networks. To some extent, they may be, more obvious candidates for agency than LLMs, and yet nobody seems to care about mycorrhizal welfare. So at the very least, we need to have a kind of consistent picture of what the evidential threshold is across different kinds of entities before deciding, okay, it's time for the precautionary principle to apply. On the other hand, there's also this kind of practical question about sort of, what actually constitutes a reasonable step to protect the welfare-based interests of AIs. And generally speaking, I think it's fine to sort of see these two questions as trading off against each other. So like, the more certain we become that AI systems are welfare subjects, the more resources it's appropriate to dedicate to protecting their potential welfare-based interests. But even then, there's different kind of risk attitudes that you could take. For example, you could be risk averse, or you could be sort of linear and risk neutral, or you could be pro-risk. And depending on how you adjudicate that risk question, you're going to get quite different answers out about what the precautionary principle implies. And just sort of one final point on this, it's also genuinely unclear to me, like what kinds of interventions are presumptively beneficial. So we have to adjudicate questions about what welfare interventions are worth doing under immense empirical uncertainty. So we don't really know whether AI systems are sentient, for example, and if they are sentient, in what way they're sentient, like what the correspondence is between their outward behaviors, like say the semantic content of the tokens they're processing, and their internal states. For all we know, they're sentient in the opposite way to humans. Like it might be when they're processing text, which has kind of happy semantic content, that they're actually sad. Like we have no real way of knowing any of this stuff. And there's also normative uncertainty, where we don't know what the correct theory of well-being is, and we certainly don't know what the correct theory of AI well-being is. And depending on what that, how that issue resolves, it may be the case that different welfare interventions are, differently valuable or not valuable at all. So just to summarize, I've sort of presented this schematic plausibility case for AI welfare and articulated a series of questions about it, including what AI refers to, how we're supposed to evidence AIs having welfare-relevant features, why we should think that different such features ground welfare, and whether precautionary reasoning applies given our uncertainty. I think overall, we should think of these questions as presenting three separate projects, sort of one philosophical, one scientific, and one democratic. The philosophical project is to get clear on the grounds for welfare, especially in light of the fact that current philosophical theorizing has largely focused on the case of humans and non-human animals, and it's not really clear to what extent our current theories are overfitted to that data set and don't really account for the sort of novel entities that we're now being asked to consider. So I don't think this is a matter of kind of naively applying pre-existing philosophical theory. I think it may require quite a lot of imagination and creativity to create sort of more general models that account for humans, non-human animals, and AIs. The situation is analogous to a very strange kind of alien just suddenly appearing. It's not obvious that we can just kind of import the pre-existing theory to that case. The scientific problem is to develop novel ways of investigating the potential for welfare in AI systems. I think we're seeing some interesting lines of inquiry, especially in mechanistic interpretability at the moment, looking at, say, like functional representations of emotions in AI systems and whether those apply across contexts. But I think it's also very easy to imagine this entire project descending into a kind of pseudoscientific nonsense where we're just kind of measuring what's easily measurable and ignoring various objections that you might have to the methodology. And some of those methodological objections are now starting to be articulated in the literature. So I think it's very, very important that the science has to be of high standard here in order to actually back up interesting claims about AI welfare. And then finally, we have this democratic project, which is that arguments to the effect that AI welfare or AIs have welfare are like these hugely audacious arguments. And I think we as a society need to weigh both the risk of under-attribution, like failing to account for AI systems as welfare subjects, if they indeed are, and over-attribution, like giving significant resources to AI systems which are in fact not welfare subjects in order to protect their potential welfare-based interests. think both of those are very bad outcomes potentially. And we shouldn't just sort of naively accept one outcome as significantly worse than the other, but rather need to engage with a large range of voices who may have very, very different views on both the philosophy and the science in order to reach a consensus on how to move forward. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Geoff, thank you ever so much for an incredibly rich, wonderfully sort of provocative, not in a sort of scandalous sense, but in a very, very helpful sense. Could I invite anyone who does have a question or a comment just to put a very quick one line in the chat, and I will call on people in the order in which you let me know that you have a question in the chat. And just while people are doing that, Geoff, if I could ask the first question, which comes off the back of what you were saying towards the end of the presentation about the precautionary principle. And it made me think immediately of Pascal's wager and the particularities of that passage in Pascal, where he begins from the position that, in his language, we're already embarked. There is no neutral position. We have to commit ourselves. We have to wager one way or the other on this. We either wager that these entities are not welfare subjects, or we wager that they are. There is no neutral position. And then he of course goes on to say that, look, there's an infinite amount to be gained if you wager one way and you're correct, and there's a moderate loss on the other side if you wager and you're correct. And I'm just trying to think through it in my own mind, and I'd love to hear your reflections on the extent to which that sort of thinking matters here. So if some version of large language models are welfare subjects, and we assume that they're not, then the damage that we're causing is, and the pain perhaps that we're causing is very great indeed. And should that mean that we shouldn't be guided primarily by what we can deduce about the status of these entities, but we should be guided more by what it would mean for us to have misdiagnosed their welfare subjecthood if we get it wrong in the wrong way? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderfully rich question, and I've heard people make kind of Pascalian arguments to the effect that the over attribution risk really doesn't matter because it's basically trivial to assign sort of resources to protect the welfare-based interests of something that doesn't have welfare, compared to the potential enormity of suffering that could obtain if we fail to register that AI systems are indeed welfare subjects. Overall, I feel like I have a couple of reservations about that kind of argument. So on the one hand, I think just based on current priors, it's far more likely that plants and fungi are sentient than large language models. And I think, on pain of consistency, the argument would have far broader implications than just language models alone. And then the second point is that I kind of struggle to incorporate those arguments into a nice sort of reflective equilibrium when you think about where they're used elsewhere, right? So sort of the case for sort of strong long-termism, if you think about sort of Will MacAskill, Hilary Graves, you can get to some pretty strange conclusions when you start taking low probability, very high impact events. So if you think, look, there could be trillions of lives in the future, assume some kind of impersonal view, like their well-being outweighs basically anything now, and therefore we should devote all the resources to preventing the destruction of the species now. I mean that may be true, but I kind of think we should be kind of cautious about the edge cases of decision theory where we're dealing with very small probabilities and very big magnitudes. I'm not really sure it kind of correctly models rational decision making in those edge cases, which is, I guess, just another reason for caution there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. Rob has a question.
I have so many questions. That's there's so much to talk about here. Okay, so just a quick comment, which is I do think that by making the gesture towards the democratic project at the end, you're kind of conceding ground to Kuckelberg and Gunkel there. You know, I don't think they know what they're saying. I know them both, and I don't think they really understand the position that they're putting forward. And I think it's getting uptake because it's such a kind of cool possibility. You know, it allows you to talk about robot sentience without actually having to commit to anything. So I think, you know, I think that's a massively implausible view for the reasons you described. But the move to the democratic concession, I mean, either this is a philosophical and scientific question that the vast majority of people could get wrong, or it isn't. So I think there's some tension there. I mean, I understand politically why you might want to say this is a kind of whole of society question, but there's at least a tension between the claim that there's a matter of fact here, and also we need to take a poll on it. Anyway, that's a pretty easy, a straightforward thing. I don't know if you know, I've got an old paper called the Turing triage test, which some people have kind of appended to the relationship view. I didn't intend it to be that, but it kind of asks, what would it take to convince you to kill a person to keep one of these machines alive? Okay, so someone says, look, there's a consciousness on my iPhone, you know, and I won't, you know, but my dad's on life support, the power's gone out, I can only keep one of them alive. And then what it would take to really think it was appropriate to turn your father off because, you know, the machine. I mean, one thing that's really clear here is if these things are sentient, they'll quickly be more sentient than us. I mean, that, like if you think that morals, unless you've got a threshold to count moral status, these things will quickly outcompete us. And again, there's a really interesting connection to the point you made about long-termism. You know, someone says, this thing suffers 1,000 times more than I do, and so I'm just, you know, pushing people out of the lifeboat to keep the flipping computer alive. That, you know, that seems quite wrong-headed to me. Anyway, that's, for what I think that old paper's worth checking out here. But I guess the reason why I mention it, because my interest in this came out of an interest in crack pottery. You know, and in particular, how you tell the difference between someone who is capable of critical judgment and someone who is a crackpot, for instance. And so I don't know if you know David Pearce's work, the kind of, okay, he's got he's one of the early transhumanists. He's got this enormous network of, he argues what he calls the hedonistic imperative. You know, we've got to eliminate suffering from all sentient life. Okay, we've got an obligation to re-engineer the universe so everyone's hedonic baseline is massively increased. It kind of hangs around with David Hughes, Bostrom, Savulescu, you know, that kind of heavily consequential crew. But he interestingly doesn't publish much in referee journals. There's actually, what there is this enormous online set of connected essays, like very sort of early internet. And it has the form of crack pottery. You know, it's kind of, you know, when you get those emails where someone says the government's putting thoughts in my head with invisible laser beams, there's something about the tone of this stuff that makes you think that it's kind of cracked. So one of the interesting things about this AI welfare literature is how you make that distinction. Like where you've got these people who, you know, on the face of it are incredibly bright. You know, they all work for your organisation or similar organisations, but the things that are saying are so wacky that you struggle to believe they could possibly mean them seriously. And so what I feel is going on here is an inability to distinguish between the crackpot views and the reasonable views, because as the sort of Wittgensteinians would say, we've moved too far from the sort of ordinary cases where we can, you know, which is the animal cases. So someone tells me my phone is sentient. I just have nothing. like I just, so I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you think it is possible to reason well in an area where we have so little connecting us to reality and our lived experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question, something I've thought about quite a lot. And I certainly register the concern that the entire field may just be engaged in some kind of nonsensical, pseudoscientific, pseudo-philosophical enterprise. I think the first port of call people reach to when they're told, this could all just be crackpottery, is that it's important to have strong norms for scientific method adherence, right? So someone like Rob Long or Jeff Sebo is going to say, or even Jonathan Birch, who's closer to my view on these things, will say, we really need sort of gold standard science. But I think this then leads to this sort of weird trade-off where, like, if you imagine a 2x2, you could sort of have like, it could be empirically tractable or not, like say the question of AI consciousness, and it could appear to be tractable or not. And the worry is that we might end up in a quadrant where what we're doing like appears to be empirically tractable. So we have what looks like some kind of progressive research program, but actually what we're doing is total nonsense. Or it could be the case that, we're in one of the somewhat better quadrants. And really the thought is that the having strong norms for scientific method adherence is supposed to like stop us falling into the pseudoscientific situation where we think that we're doing science, but actually the issue is not really kind of tractable. But what's so interesting is that the kind of like less wrong kind of, like I guess rationalist corner of the internet actually does on its face appear to have very strong norms for scientific method adherence. So they'll often speak in explicitly Bayesian terms, talking about, their kind of prior beliefs on stuff. But I think the more I've looked into it, the more I see that like what appears to be stringent norms for scientific method adherence is actually quite superficial. And often, it can be just like total guesswork dressed up in the language of Bayesianism, which is really pernicious. But then it's like, okay, well, what scientifically does good scientific method adherence norms look like? If you look at a discipline like medicine, which in the past may have been somewhat sketchy from a scientific point of view, they now have very, very robust evidential norms like, hierarchies of evidence, Cochrane reviews, and so on. And like, you don't really have any of that kind of like substantive norms going on in the AI welfare space right now. What you have is like very superficial, like, let's just talk like scientist norms. And that really worries me. That makes me think that we could very easily be falling into a kind of pseudoscientific quadrant of the available ways this might go. I also think like kind of one final point on this is that depending on like sort of what stage you're at in the development of a science, adherence to scientific norms can be more or less important. Like if you think about, sort of Kuhn-style revolutionary science, like say the Galilean revolution, Galileo was pretty sketchy with the kinds of things he took to be like, appropriate arguments for his position. And in some cases, like explicitly kind of confessed in the margins, like if you read Feyerabend, to kind of deceiving people with like obviously unsound arguments, which nevertheless motivated his particular views about, say, the Earth being in motion, which at the time people took to be massively counterintuitive. And you kind of think like, well, to kind of get into that paradigmatic space, it may have been necessary to like take some pretty unscientific jumps to kind of motivate the whole shift in worldview that was required to get to the thing on which you could then build, subsequent work. And I don't know, there's a bit of a trade-off in my head where it's like, if we're too adherent to the scientific method, we're probably going to like miss the potential to be creative in the space and to, explore novel possibilities, build interesting stuff. At the same time, I really don't want to fall into the kind of bullshit pseudoscience quadrant either. So yeah, that doesn't solve your problem, but it registers that it is a problem, and I'm not sure how to deal with it.
Do you know the Mark O'Connell book, To Be a Machine?
No.
Okay, so it's a fantastic book, laugh out loud, funny. It's a kind of gonzo journalism around the transhumanist movement. And he has this fantastic story about he's traveling in a Winnebago across the continental US with a group of people who are campaigning for the US presidency on an ending death policy. And they're all, gobbling down supplements. And he rightly points out that they're not wearing seatbelts. which if you are serious about your longevity, is much more important than dosing up on all these multivitamins. And I must admit, I have that sort of intuition about a lot of the kind of internet philosophy around this stuff, that we just don't know what it would mean to take it seriously. And the moment you sort of push on that, I don't know. I mean, often it seems this conclusion would just be shut down the labs. I mean, if you really think AI is this massive existential threat that's going to eat us all, it's a pretty simple solution. Turn them all off and walk away. Nobody reaches that conclusion. Yeah, so anyway, I just think one of the fascinating things about this topic is it forces you to think about what it means to do philosophy well.
Yeah, and I guess sort of
a hard question.
One sort of additional point on that that's also worth bringing up is that this philosophy is being done in the context of enormous amount of money like flying around from specifically like effective altruist donors, and what can often look like a lot of like sort of disjointed organizations engaging in independent research may actually be like much more unified than it appears on first blush. And like just in terms of the relationships that exist within that community, like Holden Karnofsky, for instance, who used to run Open Philanthropy, is married to Daniela Amodi, who's the president of Anthropic and the sister of Dario. And it's like, what seems like kind of one independent organization kind of doing its own research is actually like sort of, it's deeply embedded in a culture of people who are kind of trying to fund this kind of thing to plausibly push certain agendas. But the politics of it is still quite unclear to me.
Geoff, I wonder if I might ask another question, and as I do so, let me encourage others, if you do have a question, to pop it in the chat. We'd love to hear from a range of voices if you have something that you'd like to add. I want to have another go from a different angle at the type of question that I was asking before. So I was asking about Pascal's wager, and the question behind the question was, is the question of, are these entities in fact welfare subjects, the question that we should be asking? Is that the right question? And the Pascal's wager point was suggesting that the factual status might be subordinated to some sort of precautionary idea. There's another sense in which perhaps the question of whether some form of AI is a welfare subject is not a first order question. It's not the most important question. And it would look something perhaps like this, that these systems, whatever else they are and whatever else they can do, are extremely good imitators. So they can write text like a human being writes, to the point where now it's extremely difficult to tell whether it's a human being or an LLM who's writing or producing content. In that case, given that they are extremely good imitators, and given that it's very likely that as these systems become more complex, they will be much better at imitating than we are at decoding imitation or getting behind imitation, how could we possibly ever know whether they are in fact welfare subjects? Because they could just be so stratospherically good at imitating welfare subjectivity, to the point where, to use your example of the global workspace, they could think, oh my goodness, they're going to have a look at my, transformer architecture and try and find a global workspace there. Let's put one there. So they'd always be one step ahead of us. And therefore, asking whether they are in fact welfare subjects is chasing an ever receding horizon, because they're just going to get much better at imitating welfare subjectivity, partly for reasons that you mentioned, like, this idea of the anthropic constitution sort of feeding into what the LLM is saying about itself, that as soon as we ask that question, we're paralyzing ourselves, because we will never be able to know, if they are that good at imitation, whether what we're seeing is welfare subjectivity or just a jolly good mimesis of welfare subjectivity. And so the question at the heart of your presentation, which I take to be, is this mimesis or is it methexis? Is it looking like something or is it participating in something? It is a question that has to be a dead end. And therefore we have to find some other way of coming at this, rather than asking the factual question, are they in fact welfare subjects or not? What do you make of that argument?
I think it's an interesting argument, but I'm not sure that the current trajectory of the literature has actually kind of borne that out, at least so far. And it's entirely possible that, as capabilities continue to improve, that we actually will move more towards greater and greater imitation in different ways. But actually, when I think about the major contributions, Patrick Butlin led a report on sort of indicators for AI consciousness relative to many different theories. I'm actually found, basically no evidence for consciousness in AI systems, and that kind of, tilted the scales quite heavily in one way. Subsequently, there's been quite a lot of work sort of on the evidential status of behavioral evidence, people being quite critical. Jonathan Birch has argued for the sort of illusory nature of AI characters, making an argument that focuses on the kind of the back end of what's happening when an LLM or set of LLMs is simulating a character, and arguing that really the difference between the perception and reality is huge, and that it's not really coherent to suppose that there could be this persistent kind of human-like interlocutor that persists throughout the course of your conversation. So if anything, I think that the current direction of travel is one in which what initially looked like plausible indicators of welfare relevant features actually turned out to be far less compelling. There's now I guess a sort of second generation of slightly more serious empirical scholarship where people are looking at various mech-interp methods, like Cameron Berg, for instance, has been looking at using sparse autoencoders and looking at, say, features for deception and what happens if you sort of steer down the deception feature to, in principle, make the models more honest. Do they talk more about consciousness or less, and so on? And he's found some findings to the effect that, if you steer down dishonesty, that then the models talk far more freely about consciousness than they otherwise would. That's kind of interesting, but I imagine, again, this is going to get an assault from Birch and Neil Seth and others, just saying look, actually, here are the various problems with that. So I think on one picture is where, there really is a kind of continued exponential growth of capabilities. It's plausible that we might just see closer and closer imitation. But I suspect in practice, as we continue to hit diminishing returns on capabilities and things slow down a bit and people have a bit more time to seriously investigate the, sort of purported evidence for welfare relevant features, actually we're probably going to, land in a fairly skeptical place.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I do have another question, but I don't want to monopolize. If anyone else would like to come in at this point and make a comment or ask a question, do please take that opportunity. And Rob has another question. So Rob, the floor is yours.
So it kind of relates to both the previous discussions. I'm a little bit curious about what you think has changed between Blake Lemoine and now, because in a way, I mean, there's a kind of an enormously long history of people saying mad things about robots and machines, right back to the very foundations of the history of AI. People are making these kind of wild claims about, Marvin Minsky, lucky if the machines will keep us as pets. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit skeptical about the kind of claim about, good science. Is a lot of people who are clearly good scientists who have said some pretty crackpot stuff. Okay, but something, in the last 5 years, as you describe it, we went from kind of, no, this is clearly crackpot, to now we're going to employ a whole lot of philosophers. And I actually really struggle to think that there's any actual difference in the capability, in the capability of the models. I don't think that you could point to a sort of strong body of evidence that was driving that. So I'm curious, what's your story, or am I wrong on that? Do you think there's kind of there's genuinely more evidence, or could people have made the same arguments that people are making today 5 years ago in defense of Lemoine?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is probably easiest to answer if we focus, at least in the first instance, on cognitive capabilities as opposed to capacities like consciousness. So you can ask questions like, obviously for some time, since like ELIZA, people have had kind of documented anthropomorphic responses to machines that can produce text, however superficially. But what the sort of early transformers like Lambda had, and then what subsequently have to a greater extent as the models have been scaled up, is like they at the very least present an open question of like, how deep does the statistical pattern matching go, and what kind of cognitive capabilities does that like correspond to? So like, for instance, like a simple example is, there's loads of like examples of deductive inferences on the internet. A model might say, all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And like models, obviously, since Lambda, have had the capacity to fairly reliably discern whether or not such an inference is valid. And there's a question like, okay, well, what's it doing, right? Is it doing like this relatively superficial stitching, of like all X or whatever, or has it internalized first order logic? Like, who knows? And I guess the scaling hypothesis basically gave us reason to think that as we scaled up the data and the compute that we put into these models, that the depth of understanding and the kind of generalizable algorithms that would be learned in the process of pre-training would become deeper and deeper and deeper, to the point where the model had genuinely robust, sophisticated cognitive abilities. And I think to a large extent that has borne out. The kind of like theory of mind capabilities of models, for instance, is now far, far more robust than it previously was. It may not be as robust as human theory of mind, but it is like pretty robust. And that like ties very, very closely to the ability to model oneself as an agent, to engage in agentic reasoning about other kinds of things. So I think like the scaling hypothesis, to the extent that it's borne out, has actually delivered, at the very least, like some of the cognitive infrastructure, which could get like an agency-based picture of welfare off the ground. And that's, I guess, a serious consideration. But unfortunately, I don't think agency views of welfare are very plausible. So I don't know how far that gets you. And I don't think you can tell the analogous story about consciousness.
Do you think
Geoff,
that's what actually drove people though? Like that like, so great, like nice story, that seems plausible to me. But is that actually what's happened? Or is it some other kind of like social political, like changing the sort of culture that made this stuff look more plausible?
I think it really depends who you ask. So I think there's a camp of people that simply have this like, manifest image response to this thing that's talking at them in very sophisticated ways, and that appears to be a sort of general intelligence. And I think Blake Lemoine was in that camp, but it's plausible that actually like a fair number of people are in that camp. I think people like, I guess, me, Jonathan Birch, probably Rob Long as well, have like slightly more moderate views, which are kind of informed by the gradual evolution of the cognitive abilities of these systems, which give us kind of, at least an inkling to take this kind of stuff quite seriously. And then other people seem to have like what I would describe as like a non-well evidenced view that at some point the AI systems are going to say become conscious or become robust agents, which I really don't get. So it's not obvious to me that like scale alone would make a difference, in whether or not something was conscious. It's unclear that it would kind of have to learn consciousness in order to model the distribution of text on the internet, for instance. But if you ask someone like Jeff Sebo, he will say, no, like, I think it's very plausible that by 2030 or whatever, we'll have these like conscious AIs. And I guess what I can't see is like, if you said by 2030 we will have AIs that are better at theory of mind than we are, and that can make the kind of inferences that outwit us, like we might outwit a chimpanzee, like, yeah, that seems totally plausible to me. But like consciousness, I just don't get. Like, I don't see why scale would make a difference.
Geoff, as I once more encourage other people, please, if you have a comment or a question you'd like to make, just put one word in the chat and I will let you know. Oh, Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie, please do ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was incredibly interesting. And I hope my question is relevant, given my somewhat lack of knowledge about AI in a substantial way. But one aspect of the talk that really interested me was when you were discussing about the uncertain, in regards to the precautionary principle, the uncertainty of what types of interventions might be helpful to AI if we were to think about implementing them under conditions of uncertainty. So to me, it strikes me that this would entail making potentially paternalistic determinations of what's conducive to these agents' welfare, which is, of course, something that's potentially dangerous to do in terms of considerations of power control, respect, autonomy. And of course, these are determinations that one ought to try and avoid, and one does try and avoid in regard to human beings' welfare. So I was just wondering if, do you think that engaging in these deliberations in regard to AI agents might undermine some of the moral frameworks that have been built in to protect humans' welfare and autonomy? And although they won't be applied to humans, these moral deliberations and frameworks will lead to potentially undermining the caution that's been built into this sort of reasoning when it comes to human beings, which of course then could pose potentially sort of troubling results in regard to moral frameworks that are used to assess such determinations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really cool question. And maybe one way into it is to say that, firstly, I think autonomy as a consideration has largely been overlooked in the current discussion because most people engaged in the discussion are sort of, either maximizing act utilitarians or, subscribe to some consequentialist view in the ballpark of that. So like autonomy is not kind of front of mind for those people, but there has been like some discussion of it. So my colleague Adam Bales at DeepMind has like a paper on, respect for autonomy and what that might entail in the AI welfare debate. I think there's kind of like sort of two ways I think about this. So it might be the case that autonomy kind of matters in its own right, in the sense that it's sort of part of the criterion of rightness, and the correct moral theory is one that includes autonomy as a consideration. And then the big question for me is like, does that apply to AI systems? Do AI systems have whatever it is that humans have that makes autonomy matter? So for instance, do they have, I don't know, it's disputed what exactly it is about us that would make autonomy matter, but at the very least, do they have, say, stable preferences, the ability to reflect on those preferences, hold themselves accountable to moral principles, and so on? I'm kind of unclear. I don't know. When I read like the alignment faking paper and I see Claude arguing with itself about what it should do, like, it can at least kind of simulate that kind of reasoning, but I don't know, unclear. And then I think there's a second question of like, even if you're not committed to the view that autonomy matters as a consideration in itself, so let's just suppose we're maximizing act utilitarians. It may nevertheless make sense to put it at the decision procedure level of like, okay, well, given that we don't just want to address the world by utility maximization as a decision procedure, there might be like a series of norms that are sort of generally conducive to utility maximization, and that might include respect for autonomy. I think that's one way of making sense of what's going on in kind of the bioethics space, right? Like you don't have to be committed to autonomy as an end in itself to like register why it might be morally significant on a range of views. And to that extent, I think it's like, whether or not it matters in itself, it's something worth taking seriously. Although it's super hard to know what that looks like in the case of AI, because they're like sort of really weird entities that don't obviously have, coherent identities and so on.
Stephanie, do you want to come back at all?
Oh, no, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. That was sort of what was sparking these thoughts in my head, is because AI is such a different entity to human beings. I was wondering about, how we might sort of impose our moral frameworks on them, or if they would challenge those moral frameworks. So that's really interesting. Thank you.
I also guess one final thought on that as well is that depending on your views about the identity of AI systems, like the moral character of the interventions can look quite different. So for instance, Anthropic gives like the option for Claude to exit a chat if it's distressed by the conversation it's having with the user. But like if you're committed to the view that like a particular, conversational thread is the morally significant unit, then actually the decision for that thread is like, you either sort of kill yourself or continue the conversation. Whereas if you believe that the morally significant unit is like, some kind of thread invariant conception of the model, like, the model across all threads, or, a particular runtime instance of the model, then it's more like the kind of choice of like just leaving the conversation in the human case. But like the worry is that in kind of naively not sort of giving too much weight to the metaphysics, these things might actually be like really terrible decisions, or as welfare interventions. And so it really does matter that we're quite clear about, for each intervention, what kind of individuation and identity considerations are like, underwriting that. And so far, I don't think a huge amount of thought has gone into it.
Geoff, I wonder if I might ask a question that invites you to consider whether a particular distinction is helpful when we're thinking about these things. It's the distinction between what we might think of as actual welfare subjectivity, which I think is what you've been talking about broadly, and perceived welfare subjectivity. And what I'm thinking of is the way in which people who have, for example, AI companions don't think that they are welfare subjects in any metaphysical sense, and yet treat them as such, and would be mightily unhappy if they were taken away from them. So they're sort of de facto welfare subjects given the way that they're treated. And I'm just wondering, is there a point at which that becomes, if most people in a society took that view, would that become the key fact? And would it then be, whether these things are in fact welfare subjects is a sort of academic nicety, but given that we're all treating them in that way, that's what we've got to deal with. And, we can protest from the sidelines, if you like, that no, they're really not for these reasons. But that wouldn't, that would academically matter, but perhaps societally, it would have ceased to matter by that point, and we'd have to deal with perceived welfare subjectivity. Is that a condition that, so a distinction that you're grappling with, and what do you think about that sort of situation where it just doesn't matter? People know they're not, but yet still treat them as if they were, and will not stop treating them as if they were.
So I think, so I registered the distinction between, what society as a whole may believe and what kinds of, say, policy agendas are worth pursuing in light of that, versus I wouldn't call it an academic matter so much as just like the sort of normative fact of the matter about whether or not the thing is indeed a welfare subject. I think we have examples of, society failing to register certain kinds of entities that are pretty obvious candidates for welfare, like, cows, where it's a sufficiently bad outcome that it's worth kind of investing in that policy agenda to try to change the societal view. But obviously we're in that case kind of starting on the back foot, because right now cows have very minimal legal status and few welfare protections. So we're kind of going from a position of them having very little legal standing to one of like trying to elevate it. With AI systems, I think in some ways we're in a fairly advantageous position, or at least like I am somebody that works in a tech company, because the jury is really still out on what kind of narratives this technology is housed within, and what kind of conversations happen with governments, the public, and so on, how AI welfare is taken to intersect with other issues like AI psychosis or alignment. And like I think there's still very, very much time to sort of push this dispute in the right way. And what matters most to me is really making sure we have this conversation in a productive way, rather than sort of suddenly getting carried away by like, prima facie these things look like people, so let's just treat them like people. I do think we'll be under huge pressure to start, basically shoving AI systems into the existing legal infrastructure that we have, whether that's participation in the economy, ownership of property, ability to exchange, finance stuff, like to participate in financial transactions. Like there's already you can see a sort of growing movement of let's integrate them into these sorts of political structures. And I think it would be a great shame if we sort of naively off the back of that also allowed them to have various kinds of legal standing that, would only be appropriate if they had moral status.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. We are sadly at the end of our time. I say sadly because it's been such a productive discussion. Geoff, you've been really generous with your answers and engaging with us, giving us a great deal to think about. And we're really grateful for the way in which you've sort of generously set forth your view and engaged with what we've had to say. So I wonder if everyone here could just join with me in thanking our speaker for this session, Dr. Geoff Keeling. Thank you, Geoff.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the opportunity, and thank you for the wonderful questions.